Samaritan Pentateuch. When the Samaritans separated from Israel, they took the Pentateuch with them. They restricted their canon to these 5 books alone. It was discovered in 1616 in Damascus. Gesenius did not view it as a reliable independent witness, but rather a revision of the MT. This is not accurate and should be viewed as an independent witness. The Greek translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch is the Samaritan Targum. Tiberian vocalization. Vocalization system of the Hebrew text by the Masoretes, which replaced its 2 predecessors, the Babylonian and Palestinian. Based on the experience of the Palestinian system, which combined the accent system with the means of indicating finer nuances, and could represent the pronunciation and intonation of the biblical text in its minutest details. Masorah. The Masoretic notes, which are usually referred to as the Masorah in the narrow sense, are printed beside the text in biblical Hebrew. A distinction can be made to the following. Masorah marginalis, written in the 4 margins. Masorah parva has side margins. Masorah magna has upper and lower. Masorah finalis, alphabetical arrangement at the end of the Bible. The language of the Masorah was mostly Aramaic and is replete with abbreviations, causing the later generation of Masoretes to consider them unimportant. Qumran manuscripts. The most important event in the recent history of the text is the successive discoveries of manuscripts at Qumran by the Dead Sea since 1947. They are dated before AD 70. Subsequent search parties between 1952 and 1956 led to the discovery of texts in 10 more caves. Isaiah manuscript from Cave 1. The text has 2 different types represented in the scroll, dividing the book into precisely 2 halves, ch 1 to 33, 34 to 66. Either a single scribe was copying from 2 different exemplars, or there were 2 scribes with different characteristics working at the same time. The scroll essentially supports empty, but also offers variants found in the early versions or with emendations proposed by modern scholars. Geniza fragments. Fragments from the 6th to 8th century found in an old Cairo synagogue which until AD 882 had been St. Michael's Church. The number of fragments has been estimated at 200,000. Including texts in Hebrew and Arabic translations, Midrash, Mishnah, and Talmud. Also discovered was Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach in Hebrew, previously known only in Greek. The Geniza fragments help us understand the growth of the pointing system by the Masoretes. Ben Asher manuscripts. For 5-6 generations, from the second half of the 8th century to the mid-10th century, the Ben Asher family played a leading part in the Masoretic work at Tiberias. In the 2 surviving manuscripts that go back to the last members of the family we find a faithful record of their scholarly achievements. Codex Vaticanus. Part of the Ben Asher manuscripts, containing the former and latter prophets, and was written and pointed by Moses ben Asher in AD 895. It was presented to the Karaite community in Jerusalem where it was seized as loot by the Crusaders in 1099. Later it was restored, coming into the possession of the Karaite community in Jerusalem and Cairo, where it is today. Alto Codex. This manuscript contains the complete and dates from the first half of the 10th century. According to a colophon, Aaron ben Moses ben Asher did not himself write the manuscript. He was responsible only for the pointing in the Masorah. It was to be used liturgically only on the feasts of Passover, weeks, and tabernacles, settled disputes by scholars, but not for study. Codex Leningradensis. This manuscript is of special importance as a witness to the Ben Asher text. According to its colophon it was copied in AD 1008 from exemplars written by Aaron ben Moses ben Asher. Second Rabbinic Bible, of Jacob Benchim. Was published by Daniel Blumberg in Venice, 1524/25, and is known as Bombergiana. Not the earliest, but the most important of its period, and it remained the standard printed text of the Hebrew until the 20th century. It was printed in Hebrew and Aramaic version, Targum, and contains comments by rabbis. It also includes the large, the small, and the final Masorah. The variant readings were completed by Jacob Benchim. The letter of Aristeas. An account of the origins of the Septuagint. purports to have been compiled and included himself in the work. Story goes, Demetrius of Phaleron, who erroneously reported himself as director of the famous library of Phaleron, reported to his royal master Ptolemy II Philadelphus, 285 to 247 BC, that the Jewish law was worthy of a place in the royal library, but that it must first be translated into Greek. The king acted on the suggestion and sent envoys to Eleazar the high priest in Jerusalem to complete the task. Eleazar chose 72 people for the work, 6 from each tribe. They completed the work on the island of Pharos, translating the law in 72 days, with Demetrius writing down the text as agreed upon. Much of the story is fictional. The writer lived a century after Philadelphus. Also, the Jewish law was not translated to satisfy the curiosity of a royal patron of the arts, but b/c the Egyptian Jews no longer understood Hebrew and was in need of a Greek translation. Lastly, the translators were not Palestinian Jews, but rather those from the Alexandrian diaspora. Origen's Hexapla. Completed by Origen between AD 230–240, it attempted to clarify competing versions to the original text, including the Septuagint. Origen said its purpose was to equip Christians for their discussions with Jews who made their appeal to the original text. He arranged the texts in 6 parallel columns. The Hebrew text. The Hebrew text transliterated into Greek characters. Aquila. Symmachus. The Septuagint. And Theodotion. The Hebrew text stands in first place as the original, and the sequence of versions corresponds to their relationship to the original, with priority going to Aquila as the most literal. Aquila. He was a proselyte and a disciple of Rabbi Akiba. His Greek translation was extremely devoted to literalism of the text, so much so that it sounded un-Greek. However, he gained much respect by Jewish contemporaries and his translation was regarded as authoritarian. Symmachus. He produced another new version California. AD 170 designed not only for literal accuracy but also for good Greek idiom. According to Eusebius and Jerome, Symmachus was an Ebionite. According to Epiphanius he was a Samaritan converted to Judaism. His version is found in only a few hexapla fragments. Theodotion. He was a proselyte at the end of the 2nd cent. He did not produce a new version, but revised an existing Greek version following the Hebrew text. Summary. Origen used these 3 versions for his hexapla. They are the 3 recensions to the Septuagint. Lucian. A person who worked to revise the Septuagint. Mentioned by Jerome around AD 400, he indicated that different provinces of the early church each had its own biblical text, one of these being Lucian. However, this does not mean Lucian was a recension or exclusively authoritative. Lucian died a martyr in AD 312. Most likely, it was produced from the hexaplaric recension, but with no attempt to parallel the empty Lagarde's program. Paul de Lagarde, 1827–1891, was a scholar of the Septuagint who proposed arranging the 3 original recensions of the Septuagint attested by Jerome, printed into parallel columns. He proposed a classification of Septuagint manuscripts, assigning them to individual recensions with the help of patristic quotations and other criteria. Once completed, he assumed he would be able to get close to the original text, which would be far from the empty. However, the evidence proved to be more varied than suspected by Lagarde's program. Yet, it is possible to distinguish certain groupings, just not 3 clear groupings. Cale's thesis. Cale challenged Lagarde's program. He viewed the Septuagint on the analogy of the Aramaic Targums. The unity of the Targums was not in their origins, but something achieved over the centuries through the efforts of anonymous groups. He said that one should not attempt a hypothetical reconstruction of the original text of a version, but to assemble and examine with the greatest care all the fragments and traces of the earliest forms of the Greek Bible we can discover. Only in this way can we gain the realistic view of the Greek version of the Codex Vaticanus. One of the manuscripts cited in the Hebrew Bible dating back to the 4th cent. Housed in the Vatican Library. The Yacht is mostly complete, except for portions of Genesis and Psalms, which were added in the 5th cent. It has great authority. Codex Vaticanus, one of the manuscripts cited in the Hebrew Bible dating back to the 4th cent. Discovered by Tischendorf at St. Catherine's Monastery, Montana, Sinai, in 1844 and 1859. Recent research attributes to it 3 scribes, 2 of whom were also correctors. It contains portions of Gen. Number 1 Chron, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Tobit, Judith, 1 and 4 Maccabees, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Malachi, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Wisdom, Sirach, and Job. Curtin edition of the Septuagint. This is an alternative presentation of the text in a critical edition. The text printed here is not that of a particular manuscript. At each point the reading is chosen which appears best in the light of the manuscript tradition as a whole, and with due reference to the Hebrew text. It makes no claim that the original form has been recovered in every instance. Much of it is the result of Lagarde's program. Palestinian Targum. It was never edited officially, and consequently it has never had a single authoritative form of text. All the manuscripts differ from each other to a greater or lesser extent. It is extremely fragmented. Targum Onkelos and Targum Jonathan. Targum Onkelos, for the Pentateuch, and Targum Jonathan, for the prophets, are the best known of the Targums, and are authoritative for Judaism. These official Targums have definitive wording was evidently established in Babylon in the 5th cent. After a long history of development, they are based on older material that probably derives from Palestine. Their names are derived, erroneously, from the Greek translators Aquila, Onkelos, and Theodotion, Jonathan in Hebrew, who were known for their literal versions of the Bible. Most likely, they were produced by commissions. Targum Onkelos of the Pentateuch was naturally accorded the greater authority, and like the original Hebrew text it was also supplied with a Masorah. The text was edited by Berliner. The Targum for Joshua, which contains more Haggadic material and in part goes back to pre-Christian times, and edited by Lagarde. Peshitta. At a late date the Syriac Church designated the version of the Yacht in common use as the Peshitta, i.e., the simple or plain version. The problem of the Peshitta is complex and suffers from the lack of a critical edition describing the manuscript tradition. The origin is also legendary. Most probable, the Peshitta is of Jewish origin and was translated from the Hebrew text. Jewish origins are historically easy to imagine. During the 1st cent, the ruling house and leading circles of Adiabene, east of the Tigris, were won over to the Jewish faith for several decades. They needed a version of the Yacht, especially of the Pentateuch, in their own language Syriac. This places the beginnings of the Syriac version of the Yacht in the middle of the 1st cent. AD. Old Latin. Used by Tertullian and Cyprian, the Old Latin version was translated from the Septuagint and is distinct from the later version by Jerome. It is an important witness to the Septuagint b/c. It goes back to the period before the Septuagint recensions. The problem is whether there was originally a single version from which the known forms are derived or whether there were several independent versions. It is best to be viewed as a collection of texts, rather than from a sole source text. Vulgate. Commissioned by Pope Damascus I, Jerome was selected to produce a Latin text. After 2 versions of the Psalter from the Septuagint, Jerome translated the Yacht from the Hebrew text in the years 390 to 405. His work was criticized by Augustine, who viewed the Septuagint as inspired. Jerome, however, contested the inspiration of the Septuagint. Jerome relied on Greek versions of the Septuagint, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. The Council of Trent on April 8, 1546 declared the Vulgate to be the authentic Bible for the Catholic Church. II. Prepare the following identification questions from Klein, Blumberg and Hubbard. Ezra the Scribe, p. 24. The Scribe, mentioned in N. 8, who had a group of scribes assist him in interpreting the Hebrew scriptures to post-exilic Israelites. They had returned from Babylonian captivity and spoke the Aramaic of Babylon instead of the Hebrew of their scriptures. Ezra the scribe publicly read the law to them, and the Levites explained to the crowd what he was reading. According to rabbinic tradition, this incident spawned a new Jewish institution, the Targum, i.e., translation interpretation. Hellenistic Judaism, p. 25. A movement started by Alexander the Great in 333 BC, particularly in Alexandria, Egypt. The influence was strong. There, Hellenistic Judaism flourished, a movement which sought to integrate Greek philosophy, especially that of Plato, with Jewish religious beliefs. Result: Greek replaced Hebrew as the common language. So about 285 BC, Alexandrian Jewish scholars produced a Greek translation of the Pentateuch, 70 or LXX, because, according to tradition, 70 scholars translated it. Also, the allegorical method of biblical interpretation came from Platonic philosophy. Also note the letter of Aristeas. Qumran community. A branch of Judaism, probably Essenes, flourished at Qumran, a site on the NW shore of the Dead Sea, about 150 BC AD 68. Its now famous literary legacy, the Dead Sea Scrolls, reveals the community as self-identity and reason for being. It regarded the Judaism centered in Jerusalem as apostate. Led by a figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, its members withdrew to the wilderness of Judea to form a monastic community to prepare for the coming Messianic age. They saw themselves as the final generation about whom biblical prophecy speaks. They practiced a method of biblical interpretation called Pesher. Pre-understanding, p. 154. Pre-understandings are the beliefs and attitudes we construct that are used to interpret or make sense of what we experience. Since no person is completely free from their pre-understandings, they never really interpret the scripture completely objectively. There are 4 categories of pre-understanding. 1. Informational. The information a person already possesses. 2. Attitudinal. The disposition one brings in approaching a topic. 3. Ideological. The way we view the total complex of reality and how we view the specific subject. 4. Methodological. The actual approach one takes in explaining a given subject. Biblical hermeneutics is the process of expunging our pre-understandings which would distort the original meaning of the text. Contextualization, p. 231. The task of the interpreter is twofold. First, they must look into the background of the biblical world to learn the intended meaning of the text. Second, the interpreter must see the foreground to determine how to best contextualize that sense for today's world. The process of contextualization expresses anew the ideas presented in a biblical passage in the language of today so that they convey the same impact to modern hearers. Parallelism, p. 284. It is the phenomenon whereby 2 or more successive poetic lines dynamically strengthen, reinforce, and develop each other's thought. Succeeding parallel lines do not simply restate the opening line. Rather, they add to or expand its thought. Simile, p. 304. A figure of speech that compares 2 things using the words like or as. Metaphor, p. 307. Like a simile, a metaphor draws a comparison between 2 things. However, the metaphor draws the correspondence more bluntly in omitting the words like or as. Personification, 309. It is when a poet writes about something non-human, an inanimate object or abstract idea as if it were human. This figure of speech enables the poet to make the subject vivid and concrete. Hyperbole, p. 311. It is a conscious exaggeration for the sake of effect. Its purpose is to state something the poet feels strongly: the joy of salvation, the bitterness of death, the awfulness of judgment. Essay questions preparation from Klein, Blumberg and Hubbard. Principles of Interpretation of Biblical Law, p. 344 ff. 4 Principles for the Interpretation of Biblical Law. 1. Discover the literary context. Whatever its literary type, the collection or series in which an individual law appears serves as its literary context. Thus, The student should investigate surrounding laws for interpretive clues. 2. Understand the cultural background. The student should endeavor to understand the original meaning of laws in light of their cultural background. Since many readers lack such knowledge, it is recommendable that they liberally consult Bible dictionaries, commentaries, and other background sources. 3. Apply laws primarily to the NT counterpart of the original audience. For example, laws aimed at Israel as a whole make proper application to Christians in general. Since the NT affirms the priesthood of all believers, both priestly and ritual instructions would also apply to Christians in general, not just to clergy. 4. Whether a given law applies literally, in principle, or both, depends upon how it compares to laws in the categories discussed above. The reader may use the latter as guidelines for making application. Do biblical texts have one fixed meaning or several levels of meaning? p. 184 ff. There are several ways to approach the answer to this question. 1. Biblical authors intended only one meaning, and this historical sense what that text would have meant at the time written to its original readers remains the sole legitimate object of exegesis. Whatever NT writers may have done with it, we must limit our exegesis to the original historical sense of the text. 2. Biblical authors intended to convey multiple meanings or levels of meanings in at least some of their writings. These texts have several meanings that readers may subsequently discover. 3. Biblical authors intended only one sense, but that sense need not limit how later readers understand a text since perception always involves a creative interaction between text and reader. Since all interpretation is a reader-response enterprise, later readers like the writers of the NT in their use of the OT may invent meaning never envisioned in the original context. Interpreters may do the same today. 4. Biblical authors intended only one sense, though later readers may employ creative exegetical techniques to discover additional valid senses not intended by the original authors. Such techniques include Jewish methods like midrash, pesher, or typology. There probably was some connection between the original text and later sense, though the connection may appear arbitrary, if not undecipherable, to others. The process may or may not be repeatable today. Greater than option 1 is the best approach. What is author-centered textual meaning? Why should it be the goal of interpretation according to our text? p. 185 ff. The author-centered textual meaning of a text is that which the words and grammatical structures of that text disclose about the probable intention of its author/editor and the probable understanding of that text by its intended readers. It is the meaning those words would have conveyed to the readers at the time they were written by the author or editor. This should be the goal of interpretation because, as the authors believe, God intended the Bible to function not as a mirror reflecting the readers and their meanings, but as a window into the worlds and meanings of the authors and the texts they produced. The original biblical text alone was inspired, for only its meaning was encoded in the original historical context. IVSA questions from Kitchen, taken from Chapter 7 only. What are some of the main arguments for the historicity of the patriarchal narratives? p. 316 ff. Some of the practices we see of the patriarchal narratives in Genesis are found to be commonplace in the second millennium. 1. Wide scope of travel. Ur of the Chaldees can be identified with the famous ancient city of Ur in South Babylonia. As indicated from the Mari archives, pastoralist tribal groups ranged far and wide in the early second millennium in the area around Babylonia. 2. Long-distance marriages. The practice of long-distance marriages was common in the period among wealthy Shiites of the second millennium. One such example is Shemi's Adonai of Assyria securing in marriage Beltam, daughter of Bishki-Adad king of Katna, for his son. 3. Refuge in Egypt. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt reveal people coming there for various reasons including preservation during famine. 4. Alliances of Kings in Genesis 14. The geopolitics of the Alliance of Kings in Gen 14 can be treated seriously as an archaic memory preserved in the existing book of Genesis. There is a tradition of Mesopotamian kings in a conflict with Syria that contextually fits with Gen 14. The text of Yakdan Lim of Mari shows striking affinities overall with the basics of the narrative in Gen 14. The type of warfare mentioned in Gen 14 is well attested, and also religious conclusions to a campaign were commonplace. Covenants in the Ancient Near East, 323 to 324. Work at Marian Tel Leilan has uncovered treaties. A consistent format exists. Deities are listed as witnesses, by whom the oath is taken. Then the stipulations. And finally curses against infraction. This format is distinct from those both in the 3rd millennium and in the middle and late 2nd millennium, and later. Suzerain vassal covenant structure. Greater than preamble, greater than historical prologue, greater than covenant stipulations, greater than deposition for public reading, greater than witnesses, greater than blessings and curses, greater than blood oath. We have the 4 treaties in Genesis, Abram/Beersheba, Abram/Beersheba, Isaac/Gerar, and Jacob/Laban, which are consistent with Mari archives. Symbolic rites of punishment for breaking the treaty/covenant, such as killing a donkey, existed. So did the symbolic exchange of gifts and a shared meal. What are some of the known practices about heirs in the Ancient Near East? 324 to 328. The practice of adopting a child from within the household is common. For a couple unable to conceive children on their own, there must be an heir to carry the family name and inherit the family estate. Example. The laws of Hammurabi protect the adoptee's rights even if children are born to the parent as after the fact. A wife might come along with her maidservant to serve as an insurance policy for the event that the couple was barren. The inheritance of a family would primarily be based to the firstborn son, and other sons, even those from other wives, may receive a different portion of the inheritance. Early monotheism and patriarchal religions, 328 to 332. Form. The patriarchs had no temple and worshipped more simply than those in urban centers. Altars would be built and stone pillars were used as commemorative markers. They were the place of prayers and burnt offerings. The forms of worship for these patriarchs were not very well recorded like what took place in the urban centers because a dim view was taken of these worship practices. However, animal sacrifice was commonplace in both urban and nomadic people. Content. The narrator of Genesis indicates the deity of the patriarchs as Yahweh or as Elohim. In Egyptian religion, Amun became the royal god of the kingdom. Amun would eventually become identified with the sun god Re. Thus, Amun or Amun-Re became god of empire, giver of victory. Egyptian theologians in the 13th century set up a form of a trinity whereby all gods are, but, 3. Amun, Re and Ta, without their equal. But these 3 were referred to as underlying unity or latent monotheism. Semites in Egypt, 343 f. The eastern delta of Egypt was always an attraction to the people living in nearby Canaan. In times of famine in Canaan, if Egypt had her normal Nile flood, producing good harvest and green pastures, her neighbors gladly sought provision there. However, Egyptian response to this varied throughout history by limiting the amount of settlers with border controls, or allowing entry to useful people or tradesmen. By the early 12th dynasty, Semites were making inroads into the delta. While some rulers were advised to take firm measures against them, others, like Amenemhat, built a series of forts to restrict their entry into Egypt. Used as tribute from local rulers, some Semites found their way into Egypt as prisoners sold into captivity. By the late 12th dynasty into the 13th, Egypt increased with growing numbers of people from Canaan of various reasons. They would be slaves sold to pay off debts, or ancillary staff at temples,